two astronauts got stranded on what was supposed to be an 8-day mission. They ended up stuck for 286 days. And the company that finally brought them home wasn't Boeing. It was their biggest competitor, SpaceX. Boeing burned through more than $2 billion on this disaster. But here's the part that really got me. When I dug into the internal documents, I found that Boeing knew the spacecraft had problems before launch. And they flew anyway. How does one of the most storied names in aerospace history make a mistake like that? Let's go back to 2014. NASA was in an embarrassing position. The space shuttle had been retired. If American astronauts wanted to get to the International Space Station, they had to buy seats on Russian spacecraft at $90 million a seat. NASA decided to fix that by funding 2 private companies to build their own crew vehicles. The idea was competition would drive prices down. 2 companies were selected, Boeing and SpaceX. The contract values tell you everything about how NASA saw this. Boeing got $4.2 billion. SpaceX got $2.6 billion. NASA gave Boeing more money because Boeing was the safe bet. They built the Saturn V. They built the Space Shuttle. They'd been NASA's partner for decades. SpaceX, at the time a veteran aerospace industry executive, told reporters that SpaceX's hardware looked like it was held together with rubber bands and sealing wax. It would never fly. Everyone bet on Boeing. Boeing bet on themselves. After the contracts were signed, NASA did something smart. They assigned 4 experienced astronauts to serve as technical advisors, splitting time between both Boeing and SpaceX, embedded in the design process to give the companies real feedback from real flyers. One of them was Doug Hurley. He'd flown the Space Shuttle. He was about as seasoned as NASA astronauts get. Hurley shuttled back and forth between both programs, and pretty quickly noticed something that bothered him. At SpaceX, engineers would pull him aside and ask, "Do you see any problems with this design? Is this seat comfortable? Does this procedure make sense to you?" At Boeing, when he raised a concern, the response was more like, "We've already looked at that. It's fine. You don't need to worry about it." Then he found out about something more serious. During a ground propulsion test, Boeing had a fuel leak. Their engineers handled it and never told the astronaut advisors it had happened. Just buried it. Hurley's reaction: if they won't tell me when something goes wrong on the ground, what happens when something goes wrong in space? He went to the head of the astronaut office and said directly, "I'm not flying on Boeing's spacecraft." He ended up commanding the first crewed flight of SpaceX's Crew Dragon. It went off without a hitch. Of the 4 astronaut advisors assigned to this program, 3 ultimately flew SpaceX. The 4th waited a decade to fly Starliner. When the contracts were awarded in 2014, both companies were running roughly neck and neck. NASA's target was to have both vehicles operational by 2017. Neither made it. But what happened next is where the gap became permanent. 2019 was the pivotal year. SpaceX flew an uncrewed test mission. The capsule docked with the station, stayed for several days, and came home clean. Program moved forward. Boeing flew their uncrewed test the same year. The moment the spacecraft reached orbit, something broke. A software bug had corrupted the onboard mission timer. It was off by 11 hours. The spacecraft thought it was at a completely different phase of the mission, so the thrusters started firing on the wrong commands. Fuel burned off fast. By the time anyone understood what was happening, there wasn't enough propellant left to reach the station. The mission was scrubbed. Starliner came home early, having accomplished nothing. The post-mission investigation then uncovered something that made the whole thing worse. Boeing had never once run a complete end-to-end integrated test of the software system. Think about that like this. Imagine you're building a car. You test the engine separately. You test the brakes separately. You test the steering separately. But you never actually put it all together and drive it around the block. And then you hand it to the customer and say, good to go. How does this happen at a company like Boeing? Fixed price contracts. Boeing's deal with NASA paid out milestone by milestone. Hit a checkpoint, collect a payment. But running full integrated testing takes time, and any extra time came out of Boeing's own pocket. So testing became a checkbox exercise. Walk through the procedure, sign off, move on. Nobody was incentivized to push the vehicle to its limits, because finding a real problem meant stopping the program, and Boeing was already over budget. By the end of 2019, SpaceX had passed their uncrewed milestone and moved into crewed testing. Boeing had to fund a complete do-over out of their own budget. That took another 2 years. I want to spend a moment here, because this is actually the core of the whole story. Boeing didn't lose because they lacked talent. They're one of the most complex engineering organizations on the planet. Tens of thousands of engineers, decades of aerospace experience. The people weren't the problem. The culture was. There's a line from NASA's internal review that I think is the most precise summary of what went wrong. NASA treated Boeing as a partner rather than a contractor subject to rigorous oversight. That distinction matters more than it sounds. If a friend is renovating your house, you don't show up every day to inspect the work. You trust them. That's how the relationship works. But if you're a client, you have acceptance criteria. Every phase has a sign-off requirement. You don't pay until the work passes inspection. NASA operated like the friend. Concerns got discussed, not enforced. When Boeing said something was fine, NASA largely took their word for it. But underneath that, there was a deeper problem the fixed-price contracts had baked in, a warped incentive structure. Imagine you're a Boeing engineer. You find something during testing, a seal material that might expand under high heat and potentially block a fuel line. You have 2 options. Option 1, flag it, trigger a full retest, push the schedule back 3 months, cost the company tens of millions. Option 2, write acceptable risk in the report, check the box, keep moving. In an organization where hitting milestones is rewarded and surfacing problems is career risk, most people pick option 2. Not because they're bad people, because that's what the system taught them to do. That seal issue? It flew. It was on the spacecraft when Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams launched. In June 2024, Boeing finally flew their first crewed test mission. After Starliner docked with the station, helium was leaking from 7 locations simultaneously. 5 thrusters had failed. NASA spent 2 months analyzing the data. Their conclusion: the spacecraft was not safe to bring the crew home. What happened next is almost hard to believe. Boeing's spacecraft, empty, undocked from the station and flew itself back to Earth. The 2 astronauts stayed behind, waiting for SpaceX to come get them. That took another 7 months. In March 2025, Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams stepped out of a SpaceX Crew Dragon and back onto Earth. The company that aerospace veterans once mocked as slapping things together with rubber bands and sealing wax had just rescued 2 astronauts who couldn't get home in a craft built by the century-old giant. One more number worth sitting with. Boeing's price per astronaut seat, $90 million. SpaceX's price per astronaut seat, $55 million. Boeing received more government funding, built something more expensive, and delivered something less reliable. From 2016 through today, Boeing's losses on the Starliner program exceed $2 billion, all out of their own pocket. That's from their SEC annual filings. SpaceX spent less and delivered more. A lot of people hear this story and land on new company beat old company, tech disrupted legacy industry, end of story. I think that's too simple. The more interesting question is, how did SpaceX win? It wasn't superior technology. In 2014, SpaceX rockets were still blowing up on the pad. Crew Dragon was barely a concept. What they had was a different relationship with failure. At SpaceX, a failed test isn't a catastrophe to be managed, it's data. Rocket exploded? Now we know something we couldn't have learned on the ground. Thruster failed? Find out why. Fix it before the next flight. They weren't afraid to surface problems, because surfacing problems is how you make progress. Boeing's culture ran the opposite direction. Failure was embarrassing. Problems needed to be managed. Schedules couldn't slip. In that environment, problems don't get solved. They get buried. Until one day, they ride along with 2 astronauts into orbit, and you can't get them back. The next time you see a big company in trouble, don't bother looking for the technical root cause first. Just ask one question. Does this company reward the people who find problems, or the people who make the schedule? Get that answer, and you'll have a pretty good idea what the next headline is going to say.